Our second reading today is from the Gospel according to Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 to 21. And when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. When the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. And when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled, and they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. And may God speak to us through these verses today. Came across a true story. A minister once preached on this text from Matthew. And the very next week, he was fired. It was not the sermon that got him fired, it's what happened afterward. When the worship service was over, the minister's wife invited the whole congregation to the manse next door for lunch. When they got there, the wife opened the fridge and started putting food on the table. And it was hardly anything. They had some carrots, some eggs, quart of milk, some bread, and bologna. That's all they had. And then the wife asked her husband, the minister, to pray over the food and multiply it. So he did. He prayed. And when everyone opened their eyes, absolutely nothing happened. It was still just what they had there. So the wife asked her husband to try again, and he did, and still nothing. When the minister started to pray a third time, all the congregation people left. Word about the incident got around town pretty fast. A week later, the church board met and they fired the minister. Why did they get rid of him? Did they decide that he lacked faith? He failed to perform a miracle? Was the church embarrassed by the small town gossip? On the other hand, we might wonder, well, just what did that minister preach in his sermon that made him think he had a miracle in him? What about the wife? What was she up to, putting her husband in that position? Now, let's look at it another way. What if the minister's prayer had worked and had multiplied that food into a feast? Would that have been a successful, bona fide miracle? And is that what being a follower of Jesus Christ is really about? In fact, we might even start to ask ourselves, well, just what is a miracle? Our story today from Matthew is one of the few that appear in all 4 Gospels. So obviously, it had an important meaning for them. Often it's called the feeding of the 5,000, but that's not right. Even the text says there were 5,000 men, not counting the women and children. There could have been twice that many. We don't know how many there were, but we do know why they were there. They were there because of Jesus. They had been following him around all over the place because they somehow just couldn't get enough of him, the strange, wonderful things he was saying and doing. So even when they heard he was out in some empty desert place, they followed him out there too. They had had cell phones, we would have seen it online. But the fact is, actually, Jesus had gone out there to that desert place to escape the crowds. He wanted to be alone because his friend John the Baptist had just been killed, and pretty shamefully. King Herod threw a wild party, and while the rich and powerful feasted on fancy food and wine, a dancing girl seduced Herod into giving her John's head on a platter. Not only was John Jesus' friend, John was also a prophet. And as we know, the government, and as Jesus certainly knew, the government had a pretty nasty habit of killing the prophets who raised too big of a ruckus. The death of John probably caused Jesus, maybe even, to start thinking about his own fate. Maybe Jesus needed this alone time. But there's a crowd, and they're already waiting for him. And surely he's tired. He might be worn out from giving so much of himself. Surely he is sad, wondering, am I really making a difference? But as one writer suggests, he looks at that crowd and he sees hope in their eyes and he feels hunger in their hearts and he can't turn them away. So he offers what he has left of himself. He trusts that with God it will be enough. And he goes right into that crowd and he spends the whole day tending to their needs. Then evening comes, supper time. Crowd's been there all day. They show no sign of leaving. So the disciples tell Jesus, we're out here in the middle of nowhere. You better send them away to find food. I mean, that only makes sense, right? The disciples were concerned about the crowd's welfare. Plus, the disciples were probably getting a little hungry themselves, wanting to, dig into their own little bit of food. But Jesus has this other idea. You give them something to eat. Wouldn't you love to see their faces? What are you kidding? Us? We have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Over 5,000 people up there. Do the math, Jesus. Tell you what, says Jesus. Bring what you have to me, and let's just see what happens. So even if it's only maybe to humor him, they do what he asks. He takes the food, he blesses it, he breaks it into pieces, and he tells them, start handing that out. And that, according to Matthew, is when the miracle occurs, because we're told everyone in the crowd ate, and there were even leftovers. Now, some scholars and experts have wondered, well, exactly how did this happen? Because Matthew seems to leave out a crucial verse. Some details. Did Jesus use some kind of power to multiply that bread and fish? Did he multiply it all at once so that there was suddenly this huge mountain of food? Or did it happen a little bit at a time? Someone tore off a chunk of bread and that chunk just grew back. Did new food keep appearing when no one was looking? Or did something else happen? We don't know. But some have suggested, maybe, just maybe, we can imagine that crowd of people noticing what Jesus is doing. They see him take what little he has, they watch him bless it, they watch him give thanks to God for having any food at all and offering it up for God's blessing. They watch him break it into these little equal pieces so everyone can have the same amount. And then of all things, they watch his disciples start sharing it with the crowd, all these men, women, and children, most of them probably strangers. There's something you don't see every day. And in a way, how ridiculous and naive it is. Yet at the same time, how innocent and even childlike, how incredible that anyone would even try something like that. It was such a gesture of love and fellowship that it touched their hearts. And again, writers and other commentators have said that maybe they remembered all those things that Jesus had been telling them about a loving, caring God, telling them about sharing and bearing each other's burdens, about those parables about small seeds growing into big trees, about God's kingdom appearing in small gestures of kindness and generosity. And now they're actually seeing it acted out in front of them. A little corner of God's kingdom appearing right before their very eyes. Maybe they want to be part of that. They want to be part of something strange and wonderful like that. So again, one writer says, let's imagine a scenario in which some of the people in the crowd start thinking about the little bits of food in their own pockets. I mean, really, when you think about it, wouldn't they have brought something? Wouldn't you? You were headed out into a desert wilderness for who knows how long, especially if you had a family with children. There weren't any McDonald's back then. But you could wrap up some bread or fish or fruit, some meat or cheese from home. In John's gospel, in his version of this story, the disciples find a small boy who's willing to let them have his bread and fish. If that little boy has some, well, maybe some of the others do too. Some people with food might have been saving theirs, waiting to go eat it in private because they only have a little bit, afraid that if someone sees them eating, they might try to take it from them. Others may have thought, hey, this is my food. I brought it for me. Let them get their own. Might have been a few who thought, well, I certainly can't share my food with just anyone. They might be unclean. But watching what Jesus and the disciples are doing, maybe these people now reach into their pockets and offer half an apple to the person next to them, half a sandwich to the woman in front of them with the baby. Maybe others see this and start taking what they have, blessing it, breaking it, giving it. Maybe there's this buzz of excitement like a wave that catches on and it moves through that crowd. And soon there are whole baskets of food coming around and people are making sure everyone gets some. And yeah, maybe some people did come empty-handed. They have nothing to put in, but do you smack their hand away when they reach into the basket? Or are you so caught up in what is happening there, this joyful moment, this celebration in the Spirit of God? It doesn't matter. Just let everyone give what they have and take what they need. Maybe you look over at Jesus, and there he is smiling, watching this big party he just started. Now, is that how it happened? I don't know. I wasn't there. But we might also ask, would that be a miracle? A real bona fide miracle? I mean, it would just be people sharing what they have with each other. Then again, maybe it depends on what we mean by a miracle. In simplest terms, a miracle is a sign of God's intervention. God doing something in the world, a sign of God's active presence among us. So if so, we could argue which might be the greater miracle: God magically multiplying some food, or God touching the hearts of over 5,000 people. God moving this multitude to love and care for one another. God showing them how easily they can create abundance out of what may seem so little if they simply come together as one. Earlier, I mentioned the minister who was fired because he could not multiply that skimpy food on his table. Maybe in that situation, the real miracle would have been if his congregation had then, after they left, come back with some groceries and casseroles and have a big potluck lunch right there together. None of us, no one, knows for sure what happened that day in the wilderness 2,000 years ago. Was the miracle something that happened to the food or to the people? Each of us has to more or less decide that for ourselves. We have to decide, in a way, what are we really looking for in a miracle? I read a story about an explorer who travels the world looking for a true, authentic religion. And this explorer discovers a group of people famous for the goodness of their lives, the sincerity of their service to one another. I am very impressed by what I see of your society, says the explorer, but I have one question. Does your God work miracles? Well, they replied, all depends on what you call a miracle. Some call it a miracle when God does the will of the people. We call it a miracle when the people do the will of God. Now, miracles may remain a mystery to us, but we do have a pretty good understanding of God's will for us, don't we? We see God's will in Jesus. And today we hear Jesus say, bring what you have to me. We bring what we have to Jesus by doing with it what Jesus would do with it in his name. There in that wilderness, he took what the disciples brought and he blessed it and broke it and gave it out to the people. And look what God did with it. Take, bless, break, give. If you think about it, that was the pattern of Jesus' whole life. At the Last Supper, he compared his body, his very life, to bread, which he took and blessed, which he broke and gave to others. And look what God has done with that one life. That was the pattern of Jesus' life, and I think it's the pattern he wanted his disciples to follow, from those first 12 down to us here today. Bring what you have, your time, your energy, your love, your resources, your talents, your very life, no matter how little it may seem. Don't hold back because you're afraid it's not enough or because you want to keep it to yourself. Don't hold anything back, but take yourself. Bless yourself by thanking God and offering yourself to God. And then break yourself open. Break yourself open to God and to other people and start giving yourself away. Start sharing yourself with others. And then watch. Watch and see what God can do with you. Amen.